welcome back to Imagination Mansion. Today I am going to be talking about the things that have influenced me, my writing, and my overall creativity. And in this video, I am going to be talking about books. Which books have influenced me, which books have stuck with me, and influenced any of my pieces of writing or just story ideas throughout the years. First book, I'd say, just jumping straight into it, is a book that came out in 2003 by Gillian called Thora. Thora is a book about a half mermaid, half human who is kind of left to her own devices in this port town, and it's quite a simple story. It's a children's story, and it's very much following her as she kind of navigates how to human, which I know has become a meme, but I feel like this was one of the first, like how to human books. And it's sort of like got a cast of characters who try and help her or hinder her in some way, and it's got I guess a mundane children's book villain businessman who's got questionable business plans but it's a book that stuck with me, I think, because almost of its simpleness, but also it gives you very much a clear picture of a close-knit village, of a new person comes to the village and slowly works out how everyone knows each other, and sort of like the way that the village works, and the different, because I think you're more likely to spot kooky characters when there's not that many people there. The fact that they described mermaid, or at least half mermaids, in a way that I'd never seen before. Like, first of all, they gave mermaids blowholes, like, whales and dolphins, which in retrospect makes sense because they're like a aquatic mammal. Blowhole makes sense. But it was also like they gave Thora herself, the half mermaid, like scaly legs and like weird flipper-like toes, which I thought was pretty cool and really sort of like made me go like, oh, you can adapt and you can kind of like take bits and pieces that you like and discard bits that you don't, because it's your story. And I think that really like tapped into something in my head. And also I just like weird characters and everyone else just reacting them with WTF is going on. And yeah, definitely sparked a love of weird characters. Another book, bizarre enough to catch my attention, is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Carrol. I found interesting because it's this girl, Alice, who's obviously like thinks of herself as a logical, mature character, and so she kind of thinks that she's got the logical high ground almost, and it's just watching her kind of give up on that and kind of go like, no, this world is crazy, nothing makes sense, I don't make sense anymore. And it was just that kind of the absolute, thing after thing after thing of like bizarre scenarios with bizarre characters, and just it's definitely like the fantastical nature of the story that held my attention. And I've always loved like like the fantastical or the uncanny, or stuff that's not quite right, and the main character or one of the main characters knows this, can tell, and is like, why does nobody else notice how weird everything is? And I think that's kind of like, that juxtaposition is kind of like, because I think it's why Enchanted works as well, because you have all this crazy stuff going on, she's singing to random people in the park and stuff, and he's just like, why does everyone know this song? when fairy tale logic is applied to real life. And I love it. and I actually wrote like a missing chapter for my creative A-level in 6th form. I got decent marks for it, so I must have got it pretty match up to Lewis Carroll's writing style. So it definitely left an impression on me if I was able to do some justice to the writing. Maybe I'll share it on here, not on here, but like on my website. Maybe I'll share it on my website one day. Another book in my definitely left an impact pile is one that will not come as any surprise because you've seen my mug. You know what universe this is from. Harry Potter. Harry Potter has had like a really big influence on my life. Not 100% because of the plot, though that is obviously one of the things that drew me in the first place, was the plot and the characters. But just the thing that sparked my interest was this idea that you can have the mundane world, so this world that we walk about in. There's this other world that's hidden for everyone except like a small percentage of society that, you know, when you're a kid you believe could exist, because you can't prove that it doesn't, because for all intents and purposes you can't see it, because you're not, you know, in Harry Potter you're not a witch or a wizard, in Percy Jackson you're not a half-blood. And I think that really, like, just that concept sparked my interest so much. And then this was, as I said, solidified by Percy Jackson and Artemis Fowl. Just these worlds where there's like a hidden world somehow from everyone else, and I think it was also interesting to see what periods they've been drawn from, because to make it clear that like this, because half of it is obviously like with fantasy stuff you tend to put it in a different time period, almost like medieval fantasy is a big popular one, but it felt like there was like different aspects of wizarding society had been taken from different eras of normal history. Like you had like the Victorian dress sense, you know, with the cloaks and the top hats and the big gowns and stuff like that. Then you also had medieval with the robes and alchemy and all this kind of stuff, and it's just very interesting. And it's also interesting to see all the different types of folklore that have been drawn from. Like you've got Greek, you know, with like the Chimera and Fluffy, the Cerberus, and so you've got Kelpies, which are like Scottish folklore, and then you've got Kappa, which are Japanese folklore, and you've got all these different things that could technically exist together, because obviously when these folklores were created people didn't really go very far because you couldn't, you saw like China Sea or the Mediterranean Sea or wherever you were, and that was the end of your world. You didn't know anything about anything that went past there, and you hadn't yet, you know, like invented boats that went far enough to explore. But it was just, yeah, it was just this mishmash of stuff in this hidden place that could theoretically exist, and that just, yeah, just. So as I got older, different genres took my interest, and one of these was thriller or horror. The one that sticks out to me most of all was one that I got as a gift from a friend, and I think year 8 or 9. One that sticks out in my mind was this book that I got when I was about 13 called Die For Me by a writer called Carrol, and it was just so interesting to me, and it was because she had this split between like the detective team that were trying to solve the case and the killer. Like the killer had their own separate chapters, and you could follow what he was doing and the way that he thought, which was psychotic, by the way. Like, it was so interesting to see from the killer's like point of view, and like why he was doing what he was doing and how he was doing it, while also watching the detectives like figure stuff out and maybe get stuff wrong, which is kind of like where some of the tension came from. And it was just so interesting, because obviously then you had like little dramas like relationships and stuff like that, like in between. But it was just this grit and this tension that I'd never really experienced before in fiction, because like I'd experienced it a little bit, but I'd never gotten fully into like the thriller genre. So it was definitely something that kind of made me want to keep reading, and because I wanted to know, like, but he's like this, how are you not good? Like, you need to do this because he's doing that, and he's, you know, like, he's lined up someone else, like, you need to move faster, you know, there's this tension of knowing what the villain is going to do and like yelling at the protagonist to figure it out faster, damn it. Which it was just such a, like I said with like previous books, such a new way of writing, and it was such a new concept to me. Obviously it's probably not a new concept in the grand scheme of things, but considering I mostly stuck to like young, not even like young adult, more like the 9 to 12 section in like the adventure genre, I hadn't really experienced this kind of thing before, and I really enjoyed it. And I have since purchased several other Carrol books, all of which I enjoy. For the last one, dipping back into fantasy, because that's always what I come back to, not gonna lie, but adult fantasy this time. Another major player in the imagination landscape of my mind is the Poison Study trilogy by Maria V. Snyder. The overall world that these books are in has more novels, but I personally haven't read them, and I need to find them at some point somewhere. My granddad was actually the one to introduce me to these novels, and I think he actually does have a few of the other ones. And he also introduced me to he's basically where my love of fantasy comes from, because he's a big fantasy nerd, and he introduced me to Eragon and Game of Thrones. Though with Game of Thrones, I kind of gave up at book 3 because the timeline got so confusing and there was just too many people to keep track of. The confusion wasn't worth the interest in the story. So getting back to Poison Study, this was a book that was a fantasy book. Like, it had all the fantasy elements, you know, the pseudo medieval / historical based world, a world map, magic, and sort of like different types of people. But compared to the fantasy novels that I'd read when I was younger, it felt more gritty, and it felt more kind of like darker in general. Like, obviously other fantasy series have like dark moments, like, you know, Narnia has a book all about war, and you know, Harry Potter has wizard Nazis and all this kind of stuff. But it was this human grit. It was this kind of like, it wasn't the world, there's like this big ominous evil thing that's causing all these problems. It's sort of like, I as a person am in trouble, and I have had my life threatened, and I've been degraded, and because the story is this girl called Yelena, and you kind of follow her because her way of kind of like getting out of prison is becoming a poison tester, and it's this constant daily life or death, as well as kind of like all the situations she ends up in and any like allies or enemies she makes across the way. And it's just, characters were kind of like the driving force. Like, things happened, individuals did things that impacted individuals and then sometimes impacted the world at large, but you were only focusing on this very little section. And it was just, yeah, I'm not 100% sure like if I went, because I haven't read it for a while, so I don't know if it would still like hold up. And I think I'm almost scared to read it again just in case like it doesn't, because it had such this impact on me of going like, oh, so this is what happened when, you know, you don't have this overall, you make characters in dark and dingy castles, you know, hoping that today isn't the day that she gets killed. And it's just that constant personal threat that I think kept me hooked and kept me wanting to read more, because I'm like, well, does she? Does everything go okay? Does she get stabbed in the back? You know, what happens? And it was just very, very interesting to me. And it was a lot more, because I'm not sure if it's classed as adult fantasy or if it's young adult fantasy, I'm not entirely sure, but it felt pretty grown up to me when I was reading it. So I could, you know, sit here and talk about every single book that I've ever loved, but this, I think, would be about 3 days long, and I've already rambled so much, so I am sorry about that, but I will probably have to edit this a decent amount. Like, I still want to keep in some of the rambles, because I still want to show you how much I love these books, and how much of an impact they've had, and how much I enjoyed them. I still hold them dear. Some of the runners-up, I'd say, in this list, in terms of books that I would happily go back and reread, are the Young Bond series by Charlie Higson. I think it's just a very interesting interpretation of the story, and it's a very, like, good way of showing how James Bond became who he is, and also showing him in a different light, because obviously you only ever see him as an older, like, slightly callous womanizer, and it's interesting to show him as a younger, maybe awkward teenage boy, and I just love it. Number 2, Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. These will always have a special place in my heart. And though I've never gotten big into the detective story genre, I always find them fun to read, and I always find their adventures very entertaining. Another is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and also 80 Days Around the World by Jules Verne, because just, I love the characters. I love how nerdy the characters are, because I think that's one of the reasons why I love Jules Verne, is because he writes, like, he is a nerd, and he writes the main characters as these, you know, scientists, and the amount of research he puts into his books, even if they are fantastical, he tries to base them in some form of science, and I just kind of love that. And they're kind of old, because they're such old books, they're kind of old worldly, and it just feels like I'm reading a little piece of science fiction history, and I love it so much. And the last one is The Black Tattoo by Sam Enthoven, which is a bit of an odd one, but it was another case of, like, the uncanny, just like everything seems normal, but there's just these things that keep happening, and just so odd, and then different things get uncovered, like there's people who aren't who they say they are, and then there's people disguised as other people, and it's just, it keeps you guessing, and then you just introduces another world, which in the case of Black Tattoo I think is hell. So there started my love of anything demonic. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little literary quest through my history of books. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to check out any of the books that I've mentioned, I will leave the titles of them in the description below. And yeah, if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, because I am going to make a new video a week based on writing, editing, and my creative inspirations. And yeah, I'll see you next week. Bye!